Hello children, PJ Roscoe here, also known as Fairy Story Lady, and I am the author of the series Adventures of Fairy Folk, illustrated by Liz Monks. I would like to share with you one of my favourite stories. I wrote it for my own daughter many years ago, and it's called The Rose Fairy. So sit back or lie down and relax. We'll get started. The Rose Fairy. There was once a fairy called Meggy Mog. She was a little bit different from the other fairies. Fairies were usually small and dainty, but not Meggy Mog. She was taller than the other fairies and plump, with bright rosy cheeks that glowed, especially when she laughed, which was most of the time. Fairies would glide and dance and fly in the air from flower to flower. Meggy Mog preferred to run and jump and skip and dance on the ground. The other fairies loved pretty dresses and had beautiful long golden hair, but not Meggy Mog. She liked to play in the fields with the mice and the squirrels, and she frequently ripped her dress. Meggy Mog hated combing her long hair, so she cut it short. Fairies' eyes were usually blue, but Meggy Mog had bright green eyes that twinkled and sparkled when she laughed, and we already know she laughs a lot. Meggy Mog could be clumsy and forgetful, but she was always kind and helpful. The other fairies thought she was a little bit odd, and they preferred to stay away from her. This made Meggy Mog feel sad and lonely, because she loved talking with the other fairies, and wow, could she talk. Meggy Mog would talk about anything and everything. She would talk about how bright the sun was today, to how beautiful the birds' songs were, from the length of a worm to how high a crow was flying. Everything in Meggy Mog's world was a wonder to her, and she wanted to share it with everybody. But the other fairies would hurry past Meggy Mog's house, hoping she didn't see them. They whispered about her figure and her cutting her hair. They wondered what they were going to do with her when she came home covered in mud, and yes, another tear in her dress. One day the Fairy Queen called a meeting of the fairies to tell them that the roses were not blooming, and asked if any fairy would like to take care of them and try to help them grow better. There's the Queen. All the other fairies shook their heads. "I'm too busy looking after the daffodils," shouted the Daffodil Fairy. "And I'm too busy making sure the hazelnuts grow every year. I don't have time to look after the roses too," shouted the Hazel Fairy. One after the other, the fairies said the same thing. Every fairy was too busy with their own flower, berry, or nut to think about the roses too. "I'll do it." The fairies stopped their chatter and looked towards Meggy Mog, who stood slightly above the others. For a moment no one said a word. Then they laughed and they laughed. You look after the roses. You, Meggy Mog, who's always covered in mud. Meggy Mog, who is always tearing her dress. Oh, you can't even look after yourself, Meggy Mog, never mind the roses. You're too dirty. The roses need a fairy who smells nice, said one fairy. Poor Meggy Mog blushed and bowed her head as the fairies shouted and continued to laugh at her. "You don't even brush your own hair. "How are you going to brush the rose petals?" said one. "You're too tall for the roses. You'll be seen by the humans," said another. Poor Meggy Mogg stood still and waited for the name-calling to finish, before lifting her head and looked up at the Queen. "I can do it, Your Majesty. Please give me a chance." The Queen was angry at the other fairies for their cruelty, and she hushed them. "Very well, Meggy Mogg. See what you can do. You have until the end of summer." Meggy Mogg curtsied as best as she could before running off towards the rose bushes. The Queen was right. They weren't as big and they didn't smell as beautiful as they usually did. They had a lot of brown patches on them and they looked like they were dying. Some of them hadn't even bloomed. Meggy Mogg was nervous, but she set to work cleaning the leaves of green fly. And guess what? She tore her dress on a thorn. A fairy passing by sneered cruelly. "See? You shouldn't be looking after the roses. You should be looking after the pondweed where you belong." Meggy Mogg ignored this horrible remark and continued cleaning the petals. She sniffed one and frowned. "Oh, I don't know why you don't smell nice. Maybe it's because you're sick of people expecting it all the time. I can understand that." The silky petal opened slowly in her hand. Meggy Mogg gently stroked the smooth petal and smiled. "That's okay. You don't have to open for me. You do whatever makes you happy." The silky petal opened a little wider, and Meggy Mogg was rewarded with a beautiful smell before it quickly vanished. She realized what was wrong. The roses were lonely. They wanted someone to talk to them. So, over the next few weeks, Meggy Mogg talked to the roses while she cleaned them. She told them stories about the rabbits and the squirrels, the birds and the mice. She talked to them about all the other flowers, the sky, the moon, the sun. She talked to them about anything that she could think of that she thought the roses would be interested in. Whenever the fairies flew past, they shook their heads. "Oh, does Meggy Mogg ever stop talking?" said one. "Oh, those poor roses, they will die from boredom," said another. But as the weeks turned into summer, the fairies began to notice a delightful scent in the air. "Roses!" they cried. They smell delightful." They all flew to the rose bushes and gasped when they saw how splendidly the roses had bloomed. Every colour you could imagine shone on each silky smooth petal, and they all glowed in the sunlight. The roses were gently swaying to the hum of the bees. The roses were happy. The fairy queen appeared. "Meggy Mogg, the roses are beautiful. What have you done to them?" Meggy Mogg curtsied awkwardly and blushed. "I've done nothing, Your Majesty. I only talked to them. The rest they did on their own." The Queen smiled kindly. "Oh, my dear Meggy Mogg, that is magic indeed. Your kindness has changed the roses. It's making them happy once again. You took the time to talk to them. You did not judge the roses. You accepted them and you cared for them. And that is the best gift anyone can give. Wouldn't you agree, fairies?" The other fairies looked ashamed at how they had treated Meggy Mogg. "We are truly sorry, Meggy Mogg. You may be different, but you are the kindest creature in all the forest. Can you forgive us?" Meggy Mogg smiled. "Yes, of course." And so Meggy Mogg became the Rose Fairy. It doesn't matter if she was slightly different from the other fairies. They learned that being different is not a bad or a frightening, but a good thing. The fairies learned to accept Meggy Mogg for who she is, and the roses bloomed better than ever before. Forever. The end. That was The Rose Fairy by P.J. Roscoe, illustrated by Liz Monks. Thank you for listening. Night night.